Sometimes the people freezing outside are not homeless. They are simply forgotten. Snow fell heavily across downtown Chicago in thick white waves that erased traffic lights, buried sidewalks, and softened the entire city beneath a cold silence that felt almost unreal. Wind pushed snow against neon diner windows hard enough to rattle the glass while headlights crawled through the storm like fading ghosts disappearing block by block into the night. Most people had already given up trying to drive anywhere. The streets outside Harper's Diner were nearly empty except for a few bundled strangers hurrying through the weather with their heads lowered against the brutal wind chill. Inside the diner, however, warmth glowed softly beneath old amber lights and the constant hum of heaters working harder than usual. Coffee steamed behind the counter. Pancakes hissed on the grill. Country music played quietly from an aging speaker near the kitchen door. Clara Bennett wiped down the last booth near the front window while rubbing warmth back into her fingers between customers. Her shift had already stretched past 11 hours because 2 employees called out during the storm. Her feet hurt. Her apartment rent was 3 weeks overdue. And the power company had left a final notice taped to her door that morning warning electricity would be disconnected within 48 hours if she missed another payment. Still, Clara kept smiling politely every time she refilled coffee cups for exhausted truck drivers and half-frozen commuters escaping the storm for 15 minutes of warmth. That was survival in Chicago during winter. Everyone kept moving because stopping felt dangerous. "You should head home before the roads close completely," the cook shouted from the kitchen. Clara glanced toward the snow hammering the diner windows. "I am waiting for the buses to start moving again." The cook laughed tiredly. "At this rate, spring will arrive first." Clara smiled faintly but said nothing. Outside, snow swirled violently beneath the flickering neon diner sign while wind pushed icy powder across abandoned parking meters and buried parked cars deeper by the minute. Then Clara noticed her. An elderly woman standing alone across the street beside a bus stop nearly hidden beneath snowdrifts. She wore a long gray coat dusted white across the shoulders and held one gloved hand against the metal bench for balance while the storm pushed hard against her thin frame. Cars passed without slowing. No bus arrived. No one stopped. Clara watched the woman for several seconds too long. Something about the image unsettled her deeply. Not because the woman looked helpless. Because she looked dignified while suffering quietly. That somehow felt worse. The elderly woman remained there while snow collected slowly along the edges of her coat. Wind lifted strands of silver hair loose from beneath her knit hat. Even from across the street, Clara could see her hands trembling from the cold. "Do not even think about it," the cook warned immediately after noticing where Clara was looking. "We are closing in 20 minutes. Clara kept staring toward the bus stop. She has been standing there a while. "Everybody is stranded tonight." Clara grabbed her coat from behind the counter anyway. "She is elderly." The cook sighed heavily. "Clara." But she was already moving toward the door. The bell above it rang softly as freezing wind exploded into the diner the moment she stepped outside. Snow bit sharply against her cheeks while icy air instantly filled her lungs. The street crossing felt longer than usual through knee-deep snow and brutal gusts that nearly stole her balance twice before she finally reached the bus stop. Up close, the elderly woman looked exhausted. Her pale blue eyes carried the kind of tiredness that came from years instead of one difficult night. "Ma'am?" Clara said gently over the wind. The woman looked up slowly, startled. Clara tightened her coat around herself against the freezing air. "You cannot stay out here tonight." The woman attempted a faint polite smile. "I do not wish to bother anyone." Snow continued falling heavily around them while neon diner light glowed softly across the storm behind Clara like the only warm thing left in the city. Clara looked at the nearly empty street one more time before speaking quietly. "Then come bother me instead." The elderly woman hesitated beneath the storm for several long seconds while snow swirled around the bus stop in thick white sheets. Clara Bennett could already feel the freezing wind cutting through her coat sleeves and soaking the edges of her shoes, but the woman standing in front of her looked far colder. Not just physically. There was a loneliness around her that felt older than the storm itself. I truly do not want to inconvenience you, the woman said softly. Her voice carried remarkable elegance despite the cold trembling beneath it. Educated. Refined. The kind of voice Clara usually only heard from wealthy customers passing through downtown hotels during convention season. Clara smiled faintly through the falling snow. I work at the diner right there. She pointed toward the glowing neon sign across the street. At least come warm up for a little while. The woman glanced toward the diner windows glowing amber through the storm. For a moment, something unreadable moved across her pale blue eyes. Relief, perhaps. Or memory. Finally, she nodded once. All right. Clara carefully guided her across the street, while snow crunched beneath their boots and icy wind pushed against them hard enough to steal their balance twice before they finally reached the entrance. The moment the diner door opened, warmth rushed over them in soft waves carrying the scent of coffee, soup, and grilled onions. The old bell above the entrance chimed gently. Everyone inside looked up immediately. You actually brought her back here? The cook muttered from behind the counter, though not cruelly. Just surprised. Clara ignored him and guided the woman toward the booth closest to the heater near the front windows. Snow melted slowly from the shoulders of the gray coat, while Clara hurried to grab extra napkins and a clean towel from behind the counter. Here, she said softly, handing over the towel. Thank you, dear. The woman removed her gloves carefully, revealing elegant hands marked gently by age but clearly once accustomed to finer things than Chicago bus stops during blizzards. Clara noticed details automatically. The subtle stitching on the coat. The quality of the leather handbag resting beside her. A silver bracelet, almost hidden beneath her sleeve. Expensive once. Perhaps still. But worn without needing attention. Can I get you something hot? Clara asked. Tea would be lovely. Clara smiled. I make terrible tea. That surprised a soft laugh out of the woman for the first time. Then perhaps coffee. That I can manage. Clara disappeared briefly behind the counter while the cook shook his head. You know we are closing soon. Clara poured fresh coffee into a thick ceramic mug anyway. She would have frozen out there. The cook sighed heavily but said nothing else. When Clara returned to the booth, she also carried a bowl of chicken soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich wrapped in parchment paper. The woman looked startled. Oh no, I did not order food. Clara slid the plate gently across the table. Neither did I. Outside, snow continued swallowing the city beneath white silence while the diner windows fogged softly from the heat inside. The elderly woman wrapped both hands carefully around the coffee mug as steam curled upward between them. Clara noticed her fingers trembling less already. You are very kind, the woman said quietly after a moment. Clara shrugged lightly. People helped my grandmother during storms when I was little. The woman studied her with quiet interest. And you remembered. Clara sat briefly across from her while waiting for another customer to ask for a refill. Most people do not forget kindness, she said softly. They just stop expecting it. The woman looked down into her coffee for several seconds after that. Something emotional moved behind her expression too quickly for Clara to fully understand. Then she glanced around the diner slowly. Old vinyl booths. Neon reflections against snow-covered windows. The tired cook wiping down the grill. The exhausted waitress spending her last hour of energy helping a stranger for no reason at all. My son used to believe that, the woman murmured almost to herself. Clara tilted her head slightly. Believe what? The woman lifted her eyes again. Sadness rested quietly inside them now. That kindness still existed when nobody was watching. The diner grew quieter as midnight approached. Outside, Chicago disappeared deeper beneath the storm while snow buried parked cars almost to their tires and wind rattled the neon sign hanging above the entrance. Inside Harper's Diner, warmth gathered softly around the old vinyl booths and fogged windows like a fragile shelter against the freezing world beyond the glass. Clara Bennett refilled the elderly woman's coffee again without asking. The woman smiled faintly as steam curled upward between her elegant hands. You keep rescuing me, she said softly. Clara leaned lightly against the booth. The weather is doing most of the attacking. That brought another quiet laugh. Softer this time. More genuine. Clara noticed how different the woman looked now that color had returned to her face. Her silver hair framed delicate features marked gently by age but not weakness. There was refinement in every small movement. The way she folded her napkin. The way she held the coffee cup. Even the way she looked around the diner carried calm observation instead of judgment. "You are not from around here, are you?" Clara asked carefully. The woman glanced toward the snow outside. "I used to live in Chicago many years ago." Her voice softened slightly. "Before life became larger." Clara smiled faintly. "That sounds mysterious." "It sounds exhausting," the woman corrected gently. Clara noticed a book resting partly inside the woman's handbag now. Leather-bound. Old. The edges worn smooth with time. When the woman shifted slightly, Clara caught the title stamped in fading gold lettering. Tolstoy. First edition, if Clara remembered correctly from the antique bookstore she sometimes visited when she wanted to pretend her life felt bigger than unpaid bills and double shifts. "You read Russian literature?" Clara asked, surprised. The woman looked equally surprised back. "You recognize it?" Clara shrugged softly. "I like old books." The woman studied her more carefully after that. "Most people your age no longer read Tolstoy voluntarily." Clara laughed quietly. "Most people my age are probably smarter than me." "No," the woman said immediately. "Only busy or distracting themselves." The sentence lingered gently between them while snow hammered the windows harder outside. Clara sat down across from her for a moment longer than she normally allowed herself during closing hours. Something about the woman's presence felt strangely calming. Like speaking to someone who had already survived things Clara could not yet imagine. "What about your son?" Clara asked eventually. "Does he read Tolstoy too?" The woman smiled faintly into her coffee. "When he was younger, yes." Her eyes lowered slightly afterward. "Before business taught him to read spreadsheets instead of people." Clara noticed the sadness immediately. Not dramatic sadness. Quiet disappointment. The kind mothers carried silently for years without speaking about it directly. "He must be important," Clara said carefully. The woman gave a small tired sigh. "Important people are usually just lonely people with larger offices." Clara looked toward the snow-covered windows. "That sounds kind of sad." "It is." The honesty in the answer surprised them both. Behind the counter, the cook shut off half the lights near the empty booths while country music drifted softly through the nearly deserted diner. Only one truck driver remained finishing coffee near the entrance. The storm outside showed no signs of slowing. Clara checked the clock. Nearly 1 in the morning. "Do you have somewhere safe to go once the road's clear?" she asked gently. The woman hesitated just long enough for Clara to notice. "Eventually." Clara frowned slightly. "Eventually?" The woman wrapped both hands around the warm mug again. "My son worries too much," she said quietly. "If he realizes I am stranded, half the city will probably start searching for me." Clara laughed softly. "That sounds dramatic." The woman smiled sadly. "You have no idea." Before Clara could answer, headlights suddenly appeared through the storm outside. Not one vehicle. Several. Black SUVs slowly emerging through the snow-covered street like dark shadows beneath the neon diner lights. Clara straightened slightly. The elderly woman looked toward the windows too, and for the first time all night, genuine concern crossed her face. "Oh dear," she whispered almost to herself. "He found me." The black SUVs rolled slowly through the snow-covered street outside Harper's Diner like shadows cutting through a white ocean. Their headlights reflected across the diner windows in long silver streaks while thick snow continued falling hard enough to blur the city beyond the intersection. Clara Bennett stood beside the booth holding the empty coffee pot against her apron, staring toward the vehicles with growing confusion. 3 SUVs. Expensive. Dark-tinted windows. Definitely not normal for this neighborhood at 1 in the morning during a blizzard. Across from her, the elderly woman lowered her eyes briefly into the steam rising from the coffee mug. I was hoping they would not panic, she murmured softly. Clara blinked. Who? Before the woman could answer, the front diner door opened violently against the wind. Freezing air swept through the restaurant carrying snowflakes across the tiled floor while two men in dark winter coats stepped inside quickly, scanning the room with controlled urgency. Not police. Not criminals either. Security. Clara recognized the posture immediately. The cook behind the counter straightened in alarm. The truck driver near the entrance quietly lowered his coffee cup. One of the men spotted the elderly woman instantly. Relief crossed his face so fast it almost looked emotional. Mrs. Whitmore. The woman sighed softly. I told all of you I was perfectly safe. The second man stepped closer. Mr. Whitmore has been searching for you for 3 hours. Clara glanced toward the woman in surprise. Whitmore. The name tugged at something familiar in her memory. Downtown skyscrapers. Financial headlines. Billboards near O'Hare Airport. The elderly woman gave a small apologetic smile. I may have forgotten my phone in the car earlier. Forgotten? One of the security men repeated carefully. Ma'am, the entire city executive team is awake right now. The woman looked genuinely embarrassed by that information. Clara watched the scene unfold with growing disbelief while snow swirled through the still open doorway behind the men. I truly did not mean to create such trouble. Then another figure stepped inside the diner. Taller. Broader shoulders. Dark charcoal overcoat dusted with snow beneath the harsh neon lights. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Quiet. Heavy. Controlled power wrapped inside exhaustion. Adrian Whitmore removed one black leather glove slowly while scanning the diner with sharp gray-blue eyes that missed nothing. Clara recognized him immediately. Everyone in Chicago recognized him. Founder of Whitmore Capital. Billionaire investor. One of the youngest CEOs ever featured on the cover of Forbes twice in the same year. Adrian Whitmore looked far colder in person than he did in magazines. Not arrogant. Simply tired in a way wealth never fixed. His gaze landed on the elderly woman sitting safely inside the booth near the heater. Everything in his expression changed at once. Mother. The word carried relief so quietly it almost hurt to hear. The elderly woman smiled gently. Hello, Adrian. He crossed the diner immediately, ignoring everyone else in the room. Snow melted slowly from the shoulders of his expensive coat as he stopped beside the booth and carefully touched his mother's hand. Are you all right? I was cold, she admitted softly. But this young woman rescued me. Only then did Adrian Whitmore finally look toward Clara. Fully. Directly. Clara suddenly became very aware of the coffee stains on her apron and the exhaustion beneath her eyes after a double shift. Adrian studied her silently for a moment, while snow continued falling outside and the heater hummed softly beside the booth. Then his gaze moved toward the untouched soup bowl, the folded towel Clara had brought earlier, and the extra blanket draped carefully across his mother's shoulders. He noticed every detail instantly. Men like him were trained to notice details. You stayed open for her? He asked quietly. Clara shook her head slightly. We were already closing. Adrian looked toward the storm outside the windows. And you still went out there? Clara shrugged softly. She looked like she needed help. The simplicity of the answer seemed to affect him more than she expected. For a brief second, something emotional moved across his face before disappearing again beneath control. His mother looked up at him quietly. She sat with me for nearly 3 hours. Adrian glanced down at the coffee mug still warming his mother's hands. Then back at Clara. Most people would not do that for a stranger anymore, he said softly. Clara looked toward the snow outside. Maybe most people are just tired. Silence settled over the diner after that. Not awkward. Reflective. Adrian Whitmore continued watching Clara Bennett carefully while the storm buried Chicago deeper beneath white silence outside. And for the first time in a very long time, something inside the billionaire's guarded expression looked dangerously close to hope. The diner remained completely silent for several seconds after Adrian Whitmore spoke. Even the cook behind the counter stopped pretending to wipe down the grill. Snow continued hammering the windows outside while warm yellow light reflected softly against the falling white storm, trapping everyone inside Harper's diner together in a strange moment that no longer felt ordinary. Clara Bennett shifted awkwardly beneath the billionaire's attention. Men like Adrian Whitmore did not belong in places like this. Not at 1:30 in the morning. Not standing beside old vinyl booths with snow melting from expensive leather shoes onto cracked diner tile. Yet there he was, studying the exhausted waitress who had offered his mother soup and warmth without asking for anything in return. Adrian slowly removed the rest of his gloves while one of the security men stepped forward quietly. "Sir, the roads are worsening again. We should probably leave soon." Adrian nodded once without taking his eyes off Clara. "Give us a minute." The security team immediately backed away toward the entrance. Clara noticed how naturally everyone obeyed him. Not because he raised his voice. Because he never needed to. Evelyn Whitmore smiled softly from inside the booth. "I told you she would not leave me standing outside." Adrian finally sat down across from his mother while Clara remained standing nearby holding the empty coffee pot against her apron. He glanced toward the nearly untouched grilled cheese sandwich and bowl of soup. "Did you eat enough?" he asked his mother quietly. Evelyn gave him a look filled with familiar maternal disappointment. "Adrian," he sighed softly, "I am asking because you skipped dinner again yesterday." Clara looked away instinctively, suddenly feeling as though she had stepped into a deeply personal moment between two people who spent too little time together. Evelyn noticed immediately. "Sit down for a moment, dear," she said gently to Clara. Clara hesitated. "I should probably finish cleaning before closing." Adrian spoke calmly before she could move away. "Please." The word carried no arrogance. Just sincerity. Clara slowly sat at the edge of the booth nearest the aisle while snow buried Chicago deeper outside the diner windows. Adrian studied her for another quiet moment. "You work nights often?" Clara nodded. "Most weeks." "And you still stopped for a stranger in the middle of a snowstorm?" Clara shrugged softly. "I could not leave her out there." Adrian leaned back slightly against the booth cushion. "Most people would have." Clara looked down at the scratched tabletop beneath her hands. "Most people are trying to survive." The answer seemed to affect him again. Evelyn watched her son carefully now, almost knowingly. "What about you?" Adrian asked Clara quietly. "Are you surviving?" Clara laughed faintly under her breath. "Depends on the day." Adrian noticed the exhaustion beneath her eyes then. The slightly frayed cuff on her coat sleeve hanging beside the booth. The way she rubbed warmth back into her hands when she thought nobody was looking. Small details. The kind wealthy people often stopped noticing because comfort protected them from needing to. "You should not have spent your own money on the taxi earlier," Evelyn said gently. Clara blinked. "How did you know about that?" Evelyn smiled softly. "The cashier told me while you were in the kitchen." Clara immediately looked embarrassed. "It was only $20. Adrian's expression shifted faintly. "You paid for transportation before knowing whether she could repay you." Clara looked confused by the question. "She was freezing." Silence settled again. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly toward the coffee steaming between his hands now. Outside, wind pushed snow violently across the dark street, while the diner heater hummed softly beside the booth. "Do you know," Adrian said quietly after a moment, "how many people ask me for things every day?" Clara shook her head lightly. "Probably a lot." A tired smile touched his face without humor. "More than you can imagine." He looked back up toward her. "And tonight you are the first person I have met in months who offered something without wanting anything back." Clara did not know how to answer that. Because the truth was simple. She had not thought about reward at all. She had only seen an elderly woman alone in dangerous weather. Evelyn reached over and touched her son's wrist gently. "That is why this matters so much to you." Adrian looked at his mother for a long moment before nodding once. Slowly. Honestly. Yes, he admitted quietly. Then he turned back toward Clara Bennett, while snow continued falling endlessly outside the diner windows. I think, the billionaire said softly, you reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago. The storm finally began weakening close to 3 in the morning. Snow still drifted across downtown Chicago in soft white waves, but the violent wind had calmed enough for traffic lights and distant buildings to slowly reappear beyond the diner windows. Harper's Diner glowed warmly against the frozen streets like the last awake place in the city. Inside, the heater hummed steadily while coffee cooled untouched in ceramic mugs and exhaustion settled over everyone in quiet layers. Clara Bennett stood near the counter wrapping leftover pie slices for disposal, while Adrian Whitmore remained seated across from his mother inside the booth near the window. The billionaire no longer looked like the intimidating financial figure constantly photographed outside glass skyscrapers and luxury conferences. Beneath the soft diner lights, he simply looked tired. Human. Evelyn Whitmore noticed it too. You should sleep occasionally, she said gently while adjusting the gray coat folded beside her. Adrian gave a faint tired smile. That sounds suspiciously like criticism. It is definitely criticism. Clara tried not to smile while sealing another plastic container. The cook behind the counter finally shut off the grill and grabbed his coat. I am heading out before the roads freeze again, he announced. Clara nodded. Drive carefully. He paused near the entrance before looking toward Adrian and Evelyn with obvious uncertainty. Nice meeting all of you. Evelyn smiled warmly. Thank you for the soup. The cook blinked as though still struggling to process how his tiny diner suddenly contained one of the richest men in Illinois. Then he disappeared into the snow-covered night outside. Silence returned gently afterward. Adrian glanced toward Clara again. What time does your shift usually end? Midnight. Adrian looked toward the wall clock showing nearly 3:15 in the morning. And you stayed because of my mother? Clara shrugged lightly. I could not exactly throw her back into a blizzard. Evelyn laughed softly into her coffee cup again. Adrian watched Clara carefully. Most people would still choose themselves first. Clara leaned against the counter with tired arms crossed loosely. Most people are exhausted. She looked toward the storm outside. When life gets hard long enough, people stop seeing strangers as human. They start seeing them as delays. The sentence settled heavily across the quiet diner. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly as though the words landed somewhere uncomfortably familiar inside him. Evelyn studied her son for a moment before speaking softly. Your father used to say something similar. Adrian looked up slowly. I remember. His voice carried surprising emotion beneath its calmness. Clara noticed it immediately. So did Evelyn. He said wealth becomes dangerous the moment it convinces you inconvenience is the same thing as suffering. Evelyn murmured. Adrian leaned back quietly against the booth. Snow drifted slowly past the windows behind him, while distant plows scraped against frozen streets somewhere deeper in the city. He also worked 80 hours a week, Adrian said with a faint smile. Yes, Evelyn replied gently. But he still stopped to help people. Silence again. Not uncomfortable. Reflective. Clara gathered empty mugs from nearby tables while trying not to think about the overdue electricity bill waiting at home or the landlord voicemail she had ignored all afternoon. She was simply too tired tonight to carry every problem at once. Adrian noticed the way she rubbed her wrist absent-mindedly while lifting the heavy trays. How many jobs do you work? He asked suddenly. Clara looked surprised. 2. And you still found time to sit with a stranger for 3 hours. Clara set the dishes carefully into the sink before answering. Loneliness gets heavier during storms. Adrian stared at her for several seconds after that. Then he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his coat and removed a simple white business card. No flashy gold lettering. Just a name and number embossed cleanly against thick paper stock. He placed it gently on the table between them. Come see me tomorrow. Clara immediately shook her head. You do not have to do that. I know. His voice remained calm. This is not charity. Clara hesitated. Then what is it? Adrian looked around the nearly empty diner one final time. The warm lights. The scratched booths. The exhausted waitress who still believed strangers deserved kindness even while her own life quietly struggled beneath unpaid bills and sleepless nights. Then he answered softly. I think people like you are rare. Evelyn smiled faintly beside him. Adrian continued quietly. And I spent too many years surrounding myself with people who only understood value in dollars. Outside, snow continued falling gently across Chicago while the Billionaire CEO rose slowly from the booth beside his mother. Before leaving, Evelyn stepped toward Clara and squeezed her hand softly between both of hers. Thank you, she whispered. Clara smiled tiredly. Drive safely. Adrian paused beside the entrance afterward with snow-covered darkness waiting behind the glass doors. For a brief second, he looked back toward Clara Bennett standing beneath the warm diner lights holding an empty coffee mug in both hands. And somehow, the billionaire suddenly realized that the most valuable thing he had found all year was not inside a boardroom or investment portfolio. It was kindness offered quietly by someone who believed compassion still mattered even when nobody important was watching. Clara Bennett slept barely 4 hours before her alarm dragged her awake the next morning. Pale winter light pushed weakly through the cracked blinds of her tiny apartment, while old pipes rattled somewhere inside the walls. The storm had passed, but Chicago remained buried beneath thick snow that reflected cold white light across everything outside. Clara sat up slowly beneath heavy blankets, still exhausted from the double shift and the strange night that now felt almost unreal. For a moment she wondered whether she had imagined the billionaire sitting inside Harper's diner drinking coffee at 3 a.m, while snow buried the city outside. Then she noticed the business card resting on the small table beside her bed. Adrian Whitmore. Simple black lettering. Heavy paper stock. Real. Clara exhaled softly and rubbed her tired eyes. The apartment around her looked exactly the same as always. Tiny kitchen. Flickering heater. Second-hand furniture gathered over years from thrift stores and sidewalk giveaways. A final utility notice still rested unopened near the sink beside yesterday's unpaid bills. Nothing about her life had changed overnight. And yet something felt different anyway. She arrived at Harper's diner shortly after 10 that morning while sunlight reflected painfully bright against frozen sidewalks and towering snowbanks pushed against the curbs. The entire city looked softened beneath snow, quieter somehow. Inside the diner, however, chaos waited immediately. What exactly did you do last night? The cook demanded the second Clara walked through the door. Clara blinked in confusion. What? He pointed toward the front windows. 3 black luxury SUVs sat parked outside the diner beneath melting snow. People inside nearby shops openly stared toward the entrance. Clara felt her stomach tighten instantly. Oh no. Before she could say another word, the diner door opened. Adrian Whitmore stepped inside alone this time wearing a dark wool coat over a charcoal sweater instead of a business suit. No photographers. No assistants. No visible security. Somehow that made his presence feel even more serious. Conversations inside the diner stopped immediately. A waitress near the counter nearly dropped an entire tray of coffee cups. Adrian noticed none of it. His attention settled directly on Clara the moment he entered. Good morning, he said calmly. Clara stood frozen near the register, still holding her coat. Good morning. The cook stared openly between them in disbelief. Adrian glanced around the small diner briefly before speaking again. Do you have a break soon? Clara looked completely unprepared for the question. Maybe 20 minutes? Adrian nodded once. I will wait. Then he simply walked toward the same booth near the window where his mother had sat the night before and quietly ordered black coffee like an ordinary customer. The entire diner continued staring at him anyway. Clara spent the next 20 minutes trying unsuccessfully to focus on work while customers whispered constantly about the billionaire sitting near the front windows beneath soft winter sunlight. Her hands shook slightly every time she refilled coffee now. Finally, the cook shoved her gently toward the booth. "Go," he muttered, "before everyone in this diner explodes from curiosity." Clara approached carefully while Adrian looked out toward the snow-covered street beyond the glass. Up close, he appeared even more exhausted in daylight. Not physically. Emotionally. Like a man carrying too many years without rest. "You came back," Clara said quietly after sitting across from him. Adrian looked toward her calmly. "I said I would." The waitress arrived nervously with fresh coffee before disappearing again almost immediately. Adrian waited until they were alone before speaking. "My mother talked about you all morning." Clara looked surprised by that. A faint smile touched Adrian's expression. "She likes very few people immediately." Clara laughed softly under her breath. "I feel honored." Adrian studied her carefully over the rim of the coffee cup. "You should." The answer sounded so sincere it caught her off guard. Snow drifted softly outside while sunlight reflected against icy sidewalks and passing cars. Harper's diner remained noisy around them, but the booth near the window suddenly felt strangely separate from everything else. Adrian rested both hands around the warm ceramic mug before speaking again. "I meant what I said last night." Clara tilted her head slightly. "About what?" His gray-blue eyes settled steadily on hers. "People like you are rare." Clara immediately looked uncomfortable. "You barely know me." Adrian glanced toward the diner staff laughing tiredly behind the counter before answering quietly. "No." His voice lowered slightly. "But I know what kind people look like when nobody important is watching them." Clara Bennett did not know how to respond to compliments from men like Adrian Whitmore. Wealthy people usually praise service workers the same way they tip them. Briefly. Politely. Then they moved on with their lives without remembering names or faces afterward. But Adrian looked at her differently. Carefully. Like someone trying to understand how kindness still survived in a world that rewarded selfishness faster. Outside Harper's diner, snow continued melting slowly beneath pale winter sunlight, while dirty slush gathered along curbs and exhausted snowplows crawled through downtown Chicago. Inside the diner, however, warmth and noise returned gradually as lunch customers filled booths and coffee cups clattered against counters again. Still, every few minutes someone glanced toward the billionaire seated quietly beside the front window. Adrian ignored all of it. "You make it sound like kindness is unusual," Clara said softly. Adrian leaned back slightly against the booth. "In my world?" A faint tired smile crossed his face. "It is." Clara looked down at the coffee mug warming her hands. "Maybe your world is the problem." The honesty surprised both of them. Adrian stared at her for a second before letting out a quiet laugh beneath his breath. "Real this time. Not corporate. Not practiced." "That," he admitted softly, "is probably true." Clara noticed then how different he looked when he laughed. Younger somehow. Less guarded. Like the version of him his mother probably remembered before boardrooms and financial headlines replaced ordinary life. Adrian glanced toward the diner kitchen where employees moved quickly between orders and steaming plates beneath fluorescent lights. "How long have you worked here?" "Almost 5 years." "And before that?" Clara shrugged lightly. "College for a while." "What did you study?" "Literature." Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "Tolstoy Waitress." Clara laughed quietly. "Student loans are very romantic." Adrian smiled faintly into his coffee again before his expression slowly turned thoughtful. "My mother said you recognized the books she was carrying immediately." Clara nodded. "Most people do not carry old Russian novels into snowstorms." "Most people do not notice details anymore," Adrian replied softly. The sentence lingered between them while sunlight reflected across the melting snow outside the diner windows. Clara studied him quietly now. Beneath the expensive coat and billionaire reputation, Adrian Whitmore looked strangely lonely. Not dramatic loneliness. Controlled loneliness. The kind successful people learned to hide behind schedules and meetings until silence became more familiar than connection. "Can I ask you something?" Adrian said eventually. Clara nodded carefully. Why did you really help her? Clara blinked slightly. I already told you. You said she looked cold. His gray-blue eyes remained steady on hers. That was not the full answer. Clara hesitated. Nobody had asked her questions like this in a very long time. Questions that required honesty instead of survival. She finally looked toward the front windows where snow continued sliding slowly from parked cars outside. My grandmother used to say storms reveal people, Clara murmured quietly. Adrian listened without interrupting. Some people become cruel when life gets difficult. Some become invisible. And some remember what it feels like to be alone. She glanced back toward him afterward. Your mother looked lonely before she looked wealthy. Silence settled softly over the booth again. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly toward the coffee cup in his hands as though something inside her words had reached deeper than he expected. Around them, Harper's Diner buzzed with ordinary lunch-hour noise. Families ordering sandwiches. Construction workers laughing near the counter. Plates clattering. Nothing glamorous. Nothing important by billionaire standards. Yet Adrian suddenly looked more present there than he probably did inside most luxury restaurants or corporate towers. Finally he reached into his coat pocket again and slid a folded document gently across the table toward Clara. She frowned slightly. What is this? A proposal. Clara immediately looked suspicious. Adrian almost smiled at that reaction. Relax. I am not buying the diner. She unfolded the paper slowly. Community Outreach Director. Whitmore Foundation. Full salary. Health benefits. Education grant assistance. Clara looked up immediately in shock. This has to be a mistake. Adrian shook his head once. No. Clara stared at the paper again. Why would you offer me this? Adrian glanced briefly toward the busy diner around them before answering quietly. Because my company spends millions trying to improve communities. His eyes settled steadily back on hers. And last night you accomplished more with one bowl of soup and 3 hours of your time than most executives accomplish with entire conferences. Clara did not speak. She simply stared at him, while winter sunlight reflected softly through the diner windows between them. Then Adrian Whitmore said the one thing she never expected a billionaire to understand. People do not only need money when they are suffering, he said quietly. Sometimes they just need someone willing to stay. 3 weeks later, the last traces of the snowstorm had disappeared from Chicago. Sidewalks dripped beneath early afternoon sunlight, while the city slowly returned to its usual restless rhythm of traffic, crowded trains, and hurried strangers moving past one another without looking up. But inside the Whitmore Foundation building overlooking the river downtown, something quieter had begun changing. Clara Bennett stood near the large office windows holding a cup of coffee between both hands while sunlight reflected against the glass towers outside. The office around her still felt unreal sometimes. Warm lighting. Shelves filled with community outreach proposals. Meetings about shelters, food programs, elderly care initiatives, and education grants instead of dinner orders and coffee refills. Her life had not transformed overnight into fantasy. She still worried too much. Still checked prices at grocery stores automatically. Still apologized before speaking during executive meetings even though nobody expected her to anymore. But for the first time in years, survival no longer consumed every thought inside her mind. Behind her, soft laughter echoed through the hallway. Evelyn Whitmore walked into the office carrying a small paper bag from a bakery downstairs while Adrian followed several steps behind holding 2 folders against his coat. Clara smiled immediately. You brought pastries again. Evelyn looked delighted with herself. A foundation dedicated to helping people should absolutely include cinnamon rolls. Adrian sighed quietly. She ignored 3 security guards to buy those herself. Security guards cannot pick proper pastries, Evelyn replied calmly. Clara laughed softly while Adrian placed the folders down on the conference table beside her. He looked different lately. Lighter somehow. The permanent tension that once lived around his eyes had softened over the past weeks. Employees noticed it too. Meetings ended earlier now. He listened more. Spoke slower. Even the staff inside Whitmore Capital whispered privately that the billionaire CEO seemed less interested in intimidating people than before. Evelyn opened the bakery bag carefully while watching both of them with quiet satisfaction. "You know," she said softly, "this building feels warmer lately." Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. "That is because you keep adjusting the thermostat." "No," Evelyn corrected gently while handing Clara a pastry. "Because people are finally speaking to one another instead of performing for one another." Silence settled briefly across the office after that. Clara looked down toward the city streets far below where strangers crossed intersections beneath sunlight without realizing how close loneliness often stood beside them every day. "I still cannot believe all of this happened because of one snowstorm," she murmured quietly. Adrian looked toward her calmly. "It was not the storm." Clara turned slightly. Adrian leaned one shoulder against the conference table. "It was the fact that you stayed." The sentence carried the same quiet honesty he always used when speaking about that night now. Not dramatic. Just real. Evelyn smiled softly into her coffee cup. "Most people underestimate how powerful kindness becomes when it arrives without conditions." Clara thought about that while sunlight reflected across the river outside the windows. Weeks earlier she had simply seen an elderly woman alone in dangerous weather, and made room for her inside a small diner booth near a heater. Nothing heroic. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow that small decision had reached further than she ever imagined possible. Adrian glanced toward the outreach reports spread across the conference table afterward. "The community shelter project opens next month," he said quietly. "Applications already doubled after the announcement." Clara smiled faintly. "That is good." Adrian looked at her carefully. "You changed the direction of this foundation in less than 30 days. Clara immediately shook her head. "No. I just reminded people to pay attention." Evelyn pointed gently toward her with the pastry. "Exactly." Outside, Chicago shimmered beneath soft winter sunlight, while life continued moving endlessly through crowded streets below. Inside the office overlooking the city, the billionaire CEO who once believed success mattered more than connection stood quietly beside the waitress who had unknowingly restored something wealth could never purchase back into his life. Not romance. Not admiration. Something far rarer. Faith in people again. Adrian walked toward the windows beside Clara and looked down at the city in silence for a moment before speaking softly. "Do you know the strange thing?" Clara glanced toward him. He smiled faintly. "I spent years believing powerful people change the world." His eyes moved toward the crowded streets below where ordinary strangers hurried through ordinary lives without recognition. "Turns out sometimes it is just one tired waitress offering soup to someone nobody else noticed." Clara laughed quietly beneath her breath while sunlight warmed the office windows around them. And somewhere deep inside Chicago, countless strangers continued passing one another every day without understanding how completely a single act of kindness could alter the direction of someone's life forever. Because the people who change the world rarely realize they are doing it while it happens.